Welcome back for part 3 of Critical History series on the 30 Years' War. If you haven't yet watched the first 2 parts, what are you doing watching this one? In the last video, we briefly discussed some of the transformational world events that were either a result of the 30 Years' War or at the very least, contemporaneous with it, such as the introduction of the institution of serfdom in Russia and the adoption of isolationism in Japan. Another interesting event was the division of Portugal and Spain in 1640, which had been in dynastic union with each other since 1580. Here are 2 more tidbits for you. Less than a decade before the 30 Years' War began, in 1610, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant King of France, was assassinated. Now, big deal, you're saying. Kings are assassinated all the time. Well, what's interesting is that he was assassinated on the same day that his second wife, Marie de Medici, was crowned Queen of France. They'd already been married for a few years, but she had not yet been crowned. That is to say, she had no regal power before that day. Well, in 1627, something similar occurred. The same day that Maria of Mantua married the Duke of Nevers, the Duke of Mantua, her cousin, died, aged 33. This caused the Mantuan War, which is considered yet another theater of the 30 Years' War. Once we reach the conclusion of the war, we can attempt to summarize and draw some conclusions about what secrets this conflict is hiding. So let's get down to it. There is a fascinating story of coin debasement and hyperinflation that occurred during the 30 Years' War, known as the Kipper- und Wipper-Zeit, but we'll have to get back to that. In case you're wondering though, that translates as the coin clipping and seesaw time. We had last discussed the Battle of Breitenfeld, where the Saxon and Swedish forces had managed to defeat the Imperial Catholic League troops in a massive battle, almost 40,000 men on each side. After their victory, the Swedish-Saxon army moved roughly southwest, and within 2 months they had besieged Frankfurt. They were unsuccessful, although it seems likely they were financially incentivized to move on. Frankfurt is notable for its ability to remain neutral throughout basically the entire 30 Years' War, and as a result, it was never sacked or pillaged. This would have tremendous implications over the following decades and even centuries. To be more specific, certain banking dynasties arose in Frankfurt over the next century, and it seems exceedingly likely to me that their initial fortunes were accrued during the 30 Years' War. Gustav's army built a fort outside Mainz, Gustavusburg, and the next spring they traveled southeast, laying siege to a number of cities in Bavaria, including Donauwörth and Munich. Tilly, the defeated Catholic League general from Breitenfeld, died around this time, spring 1632, from an infected gunshot wound, and Gustav died not long after, in November, during the Battle of Lutzen. Another Catholic League general, Pappenheim, also died during the Battle of Lutzen, notable for being fought very late in the year and in a thick fog. The result was a Pyrrhic victory for the Swedes, having lost many soldiers as well as their king. During the battle, it seems news of Gustav's death was suppressed, for obvious reasons, and not long after, the Swedish troops mutinied, demanding that their wages owed to them for the previous 2 years finally be paid. Then, in February 1634, Scottish and Irish mercenaries killed Wallenstein, the empire's most successful general. The crazy part is, it was supposedly the emperor who hired them, or at least who wanted him dead, as the emperor feared he was becoming too powerful and increasingly ambitious. With that, pretty much every successful general from the first 16 years of the war was dead. There was a major shift in the war's momentum, and much of Germany came back under imperial control. Peace negotiations were started in 1635 that culminated in the Peace of Prague. But just as that peace was being reached, France finally entered the war directly. Up until then, they had only been involved indirectly, but on May 26, 1635, France declared war against Spain. The first 2 years went poorly for the French, and the Spanish army approached within 80 miles of Paris before being driven back. In 1638, though, after 3 years of fighting, things finally turned around for the French, and they started a series of victories, both in battles and sieges. Around this time, Saxony actually switched back from being allied to the Protestants and Swedes to fighting on behalf of the empire. And a group of mercenaries that had fought for the French also entertained offers from all sides, basically acting as a modern-day free agent would in professional sports, before deciding to re-sign a contract with the King of France. Much of the French success came because the Spanish and imperial forces were being forced to fight against them, the Dutch, and the Swedes, all at the same time, on 3 different fronts. For the next few years, the major theaters were the Low Countries, Germany's northeast, Bohemia, and Bavaria. The French and Swedish, along with their mercenaries, made steady progress, and eventually, after decades of conflict, the Emperor and King of Spain were willing to make peace with the Protestants. What's interesting is that negotiations started well before the Peace of Westphalia was agreed. Terms were only reached late in 1648, but the Congress started in July 1643. There was no armistice or ceasefire. The fighting actually continued the whole time. This is perhaps something Germans had forgotten by November 1918. War is considered, after all, to be no more than politics by other means. So ultimately, who benefited? Well, the end of the 30 Years' War coincides with the rise of France and England as major powers, and the Dutch East India Company was extremely prosperous in the era that followed. In Germany, rural areas suffered greatly, but there were some cities and citizens that benefited from the prolonged conflict. Let me read a small passage from Essential History's The 30 Years' War by Richard Bonney, where he quotes a witness. The principal beneficiaries of the plundering were often not the soldiers, but the citizens of neighboring towns, who bought up the stolen goods for a fraction of their value from looters mainly interested in cash, either as a more portable form of booty or as the price of their next meal. It is difficult for me to emphasize just how important that statement is. Wow. It wasn't the soldiers who benefited from their sieges and sacks and plundering. It was the citizens, the money changers of neighboring towns. Here was how the mayor of Magdeburg at the time described it. The most magnificent garments, silk, gold and silver lace, linen and other household goods, were bought by the army settlers for a mere song and peddled about by the cartload all through the bishopric of Magdeburg, and in Anhalt and Brunswick. Gold chains and rings, jewels, and every kind of gold and silver utensils were to be bought from the common soldiers for 1/10 of their real value. This shows you the desperation the soldiers experienced. Even though they had a great deal of silver and gold, they were starving and desperate. And as a result, the settlers, the merchants who sold supplies to the armies, took advantage of them. Ultimately, it seems they were some of the biggest winners in the entire conflict. Frankfurt and the surrounding area of Hesse appear to have benefited as well. Again, quoting from Essential History. In the 18th century, Hesse had an army larger in relation to its population than Prussia, because some of these troops could be hired out abroad as mercenaries. Famously, the British hired Hessian mercenaries to help them fight against America in the War of Independence. Who lost? Well, the balance of power definitely shifted against the Austrian Habsburgs and the Kingdom of Spain, although they were still highly influential for the next few hundred years, only losing their status definitively in the Spanish-American War, and after the end of World War I broke up the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires. Who else lost out? Not long after the Peace of Westphalia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had to deal with a Cossack rebellion known as the Khmelnytsky Uprising, which went on for 9 years, and after that, Poland was invaded by Sweden in a period known as the Deluge, a reference to the biblical flood, of course. Ultimately, over the next 120 years, the Commonwealth would be partitioned and dismantled, bit by bit, with Austria, Prussia, and Russia all taking chunks for themselves. And last but not least, of course, there's the plight of the Russian peasants, who were forced into serfdom in 1649. One of the major points I've tried to emphasize is that history can be misrepresented simply by omitting certain facts. For example, by calling it the 30 Years' War and saying it occurred from 1618 to 1648, and specifically by focusing only on what happened in one theater of the war, we are downplaying what happened before and immediately after, and what happened outside of this theater. In that respect, these 3 videos should be seen as a preliminary introduction. In the future, we will take a closer look at incidents seemingly unrelated or on the periphery of this massive conflict. Which kingdoms experienced turmoil immediately before or after the war? How did warfare change during this period? What banking families arose in Frankfurt? And more. The next video I'll be doing, though, will be about a period 200 years after the Peace of Westphalia, the 1848 revolutions. If you've never heard about the 1848 revolutions across Europe, well, all I can say is you're going to want to see this. That about does it for this episode. If you like this video, hit that like, subscribe. If you're interested in the development of early gunpowder weapons, check out my book, Conquest of Truth. And until next time, stay critical.